There are very few people in the entertainment world who manage to stay beloved for decades without accumulating a single enemy. Dolly Parton has always seemed like that rare exception, a woman so warm, so generous, and so fundamentally decent that the idea of her hating anyone feels almost impossible. She smiles through interviews, deflects personal questions with humor, and has built a public image that feels as golden and untarnished as her voice. But here is the truth that most fans never get to hear. Even Dolly Parton has her limits. Behind the rhinestones and the laughter, behind the carefully crafted image of America's sweetheart, there have been real moments of pain, real instances of betrayal, and real relationships that curdle from admiration into something much darker. The music industry is not a kind place, and over the course of a career that now spans more than 6 decades, Dolly has crossed paths with people who tested her patience, disrespected her work, violated her trust, and in some cases, tried to diminish everything she had built. She has rarely spoken about these conflicts in raw, unfiltered terms. But the receipts exist. The interviews are out there. And when you put it all together, a very different picture of Dolly Parton begins to emerge. One that is, if anything, even more admirable than the one you already know. Today, we are going to pull back the curtain on 5 singers and personalities who pushed Dolly Parton to her breaking point. These are not rumors or tabloid speculation. These are documented conflicts, publicly acknowledged tensions, and in some cases, legal battles that changed the course of her career. So settle in, because Dolly's story is about to get a whole lot more complicated. To understand Dolly Parton, you have to understand Porter Wagoner. Before Dolly was a global phenomenon, she was a young woman from Locust Ridge, Tennessee, with a voice bigger than the mountain she grew up in and a hunger to match. Porter Wagoner was the man who gave her a national stage. He was already a country music institution by the time Dolly joined his television show in 1967, and when he chose her to replace his departing female vocalist, it seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. And it was. Make no mistake about that. Porter Wagoner's show gave Dolly access to millions of viewers at a time when she was still an unknown. Their duets became legendary. Their chemistry on screen was undeniable. Together, they scored hit after hit, and Dolly grew from a promising newcomer into a genuine star. She owed him a great deal, and she knew it. She has said so many times over the years. But here is where the story gets complicated. Porter Wagoner was not simply a mentor. He was a controller. As Dolly's star grew brighter, his grip on her career grew tighter. He managed her appearances, made decisions about her recordings, and treated her less like a creative partner and more like a valuable asset he owned. For a woman who had been writing her own songs since childhood, who had an artistic vision that was entirely her own, this arrangement became suffocating. By the early 1970s, Dolly was done. She wanted a solo career. She wanted creative freedom. She wanted to be seen as more than the female half of a television duo. When she finally told Porter she was leaving, he did not take it well. She has described in interviews just how difficult those conversations were, how he struggled to hear what she was saying, how deeply their professional and personal lives had become entangled in ways that made separation feel almost impossible. She stayed longer than she planned to. She honored her commitments. But eventually, in 1974, she walked away. And she thought that was the end of it. It was not. 5 years later, in 1979, Porter Wagoner came back, not with a phone call, but with a lawsuit. He sued Dolly for $3 million, claiming she had broken their contract and owed him management fees and a portion of her earnings. For Dolly, who had always thought of Porter as a complicated but ultimately significant figure in her life, this felt like a knife in the back. She had not left him in a blaze of scandal. She had not publicly trashed him. She had been, by most accounts, as gracious as a person could be in a painful situation. And this was how he responded. She settled the case out of court, because Dolly has never been one to enjoy public battles. But the wound ran deep. This was not just a business dispute. This was a man who had claimed to care about her, who had invested years in their partnership, who had watched her become something extraordinary, and his response to her independence was litigation. It said everything about how he had always seen her. Not as a person, but as a product. What makes this chapter of Dolly's life genuinely moving is what came after. Time passed. Anger faded. In 2002, Dolly inducted Porter Wagoner into the Country Music Hall of Fame. She stood on that stage and honored him, even after everything. When he was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2007, she visited him in the hospital. And when he passed away shortly after, she held a tribute concert at Dollywood, not for publicity, but because whatever he had done to her, he had also helped make her who she was. That is the kind of grace that cannot be performed. It has to be real. On paper, the collaboration between Dolly Parton, Linda Ronstadt, and Emmylou Harris was a dream. 3 of the most gifted women in the history of American music, combining their voices on a single record. The result, the album Trio released in 1987, was everything fans hoped it would be. It topped the charts, earned a Grammy, and stands today as one of the most celebrated collaborative albums in country music history. But behind the scenes, the making of that album was far from harmonious, at least between Dolly and Linda. The two women had very different relationships with the recording process. Dolly is efficient. She is prepared. She comes in, she delivers, and she trusts her instincts. Linda Ronstadt, on the other hand, is a perfectionist of the highest order. She will spend hours on a single vocal line, chasing some ideal version of a note that she may or may not ever actually capture. Neither approach is wrong. But when you put them together in a studio under the pressures of competing schedules and label politics, the friction is inevitable. Dolly has spoken openly about how challenging it was to work with Linda's pace. She has described wanting to push through, to keep moving, to get the work done, and finding herself waiting, repeatedly, while Linda worked through her process. Emmylou Harris served as the calm center of the trio, the mediator who kept things from falling apart entirely. But even Emmylou could only do so much. When the time came to record a follow-up, Trio 2, the tensions had not resolved. They recorded it in 1994, but label disputes and logistical nightmares delayed the release for 5 years. By the time the album finally came out in 1999, the personal relationships between the women had been strained to their limits. What made things worse was that Linda went public with her frustrations. She gave interviews in which she described Dolly as unreliable, as someone who would cancel plans, show up late, and prioritize her solo career over the group's collective work. In Linda's telling, Dolly's lack of consistent commitment had undermined what should have been a beautiful creative partnership. These were pointed words from a woman who did not typically involve herself in public disputes. For Dolly, who takes her reputation for professionalism seriously and who has always considered her word to be binding, these accusations stung. She had her reasons for the scheduling difficulties. She was, at that point in her career, managing one of the most demanding entertainment portfolios in the business, but Linda's willingness to air those grievances publicly felt like a betrayal of the sisterhood they had built together. The two women have never been openly hostile toward each other since. But anyone paying close attention knows that the warmth is gone. What was once genuine musical sisterhood cooled into polite distance. And sometimes, that kind of quiet estrangement is harder to bear than an outright fight. This one is different from the others, because Dolly's conflict was not really with Elvis himself. By all accounts, she adored him. She respected his talent enormously and understood exactly what he represented to American music. When his team approached her about the possibility of Elvis recording her song I Will Always Love You, she was genuinely moved. But then the terms of the deal were revealed, and everything changed. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's notoriously aggressive manager, had a policy when it came to acquiring songs for his client. He demanded a significant cut of the publishing rights, in some accounts, as much as 50%. This was his standard operating procedure, and it had worked for decades because most artists and songwriters were either too starstruck or too intimidated to say no to the king of rock and roll. Dolly Parton said no. She said no even though she knew what it might cost her professionally. She said no even though Elvis reportedly loved the song deeply and genuinely wanted to record it. She said no because she understood something that a lot of people in similar positions did not. That her songs were not just her art, they were her financial foundation. I Will Always Love You was her publishing company's most valuable asset. Surrendering half of it, even to Elvis Presley, would have been an act of professional self-destruction dressed up as an honor. She later described the conversation in careful terms, acknowledging the difficulty of the moment while remaining clear about why she made the choice she did. She knew what the song was worth. She believed in its long-term value. And she refused to let anyone, regardless of their fame or stature, take advantage of her because she was a young woman from Tennessee who was supposed to be grateful for the attention. Elvis was reportedly hurt by her refusal. There was, according to Dolly, a noticeable change in their dynamic after that. The king did not lash out, but the warmth between them diminished. And Dolly has admitted that this saddened her, because she had nothing but respect for him as an artist. History, of course, vindicated her completely. Whitney Houston's recording of I Will Always Love You became one of the best-selling singles in music history, and Dolly earned royalties that transformed her financial position forever. Every time that song plays anywhere in the world, Dolly gets paid, because she held the line when it would have been so much easier to give in. That is not stubbornness. That is self-respect in action. If there is one conflict on this list that pushed Dolly Parton to her absolute breaking point, this is it. Not the lawsuit from Porter Wagoner. Not the public criticism from Linda Ronstadt. Not the pressure from Colonel Tom Parker. What Howard Stern did in 2008 was something else entirely. A violation so personal and so deliberate that it provoked one of the most emotional public statements Dolly has ever made. Stern, the self-proclaimed king of all media, built his career on shock value. He said things nobody else would say, went places nobody else would go, and treated controversy not as a risk but as a strategy. His fan base adored him for it. His critics found him reprehensible. For decades, he operated in a space where the usual rules did not seem to apply. Then his team produced a segment using recordings from Dolly's audiobook, her own voice, her own words, spliced together to create a fabricated audio clip that made it sound like she was saying deeply offensive, vulgar, and racist things. Things that were the polar opposite of everything Dolly Parton has ever stood for. They played it on air and laughed.